Well, thank you very much, Lord Desai, Professor Callahan, and my friends. I should admit that they are friends, Professor Rana and Stephan Feuchtwang. So I'm sure they will be gentle in their, relatively speaking, in their comments. And I am delighted to be here. We've been looking forward to this event. And my editor is also here, Dr. Lucy Reimer, who has helped me a great deal in writing this book. And so let me proceed without further ado, talking about the book, because we don't have so much time, and I want to really hear the others as well and their commentaries. This is a picture that some of you will notice is on the cover of the book, and you'll see it around. So somehow we forgot to put the full annotation on it. But it gives me an opportunity to discuss what this picture is about. Well, it is a group of protesters who call themselves Cambodia's avatars. Avatars appealing to the Cambodian government to save the Prelang forest. So they are indigenous people of the Prelang forest who are using the title of avatar. Avatar, for those of you in Asian studies who may be familiar, is the reincarnated being, and it's an ancient Hindu-Buddhist idea. But what is happening here is that they are using the expression via the Hollywood movie Avatar. And so what it is that, of course, there's a slight problem in that the avatars in the Hollywood movie were not the Aboriginal people, or I don't know if they were people or not in that continent, in that planet, but it was really the humans who went in their different avatars. But nonetheless, they decided to depict themselves as the forest beings and so re-invoke what is there, an ancient idea among these people to appeal to their cause and to draw attention to their cause. So this is an expression of what I would call, which is a very important concept in the book, circulatory history, right? It is a history which returns to the people via many different global routes to serve a somewhat different project or a goal, but is very much part of the history as well. So as I say, the most important things I try to do in the book is to try and establish history as a circulatory form. So not circular, but it circulates in different areas and comes around and gets transformed in the way. And what I want to do with is to try to substitute the idea of the dominant idea of history that we have, which is linear, tunneled, and bounded histories of nations or civilizations or peoples and so on. So let me talk a little bit more about how I think about this idea of histories as circulatory. Events can have effects that disperse massively over time. Right? We think that an event is focused in a time and place. But of course, a war in one place can have effects on prices in a third and a fourth and a fifth place. It can affect political coalitions many thousands of miles away. And it can do many other things. And I give you an example from my own personal history, or the history of my ancestors, which is the story of the Ahoms. Let me take you to the next slide. The Ahoms, do we have a pointer? Where it says China and then it says India, there is in that northeast corner of India and southwest part of China, there is the Brahmaputra River, the Brahmaputra Valley. And the Brahmaputra Valley was ruled for about 6 centuries by a group called the Ahoms. And the word Assam then comes from the Ahoms. Although the people are all mixed, they're not necessarily Ahom. But what happens is that the Ahoms used to live in an area in a kingdom in southwest China, in Yunnan, called the Dailue Kingdom, which was a Buddhist kingdom that was never conquered by the Chinese. It is not till the Mongols, who established the empire in southwest China, that they conquered not only the Dailue, but also Burma. And what happened was, during those decades of instability in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Ahom people, who had a different name at that time, were pushed out and they moved into the Brahmaputra Valley. Right? They conquered the people there and kept out Mughal forces and so on until the British in the 1820s. They retained their independence because they had very good river technology and knowledge of river systems and so on in that area. People of my background were often, the ancestors were often served. Duara, in fact, refers to the customs officials of the doors, and served in the Ahom kingdom. So I'm trying to tell you something, a very distant event, like the Mongol invasion, affected places which we thought had no connection to such kinds of events, right? So let me go back here. Now, it is not only circulatory or events which have impacts that are dispersed and diffused all over. It is also narratives that are formed. Now, think of narratives. Narratives are, of course, the ways you represent, you write your histories of events. And if you think of how a mid-19th century or even a mid-20th century imperialist victory may have been celebrated through imperial histories, whether British or Japanese or whatever, you see how they're depicted now, because the narrative has been appropriated by different sets of people. In fact, in places like Japan, there is the concern that the textbooks that young Japanese people will have to read will not be narratives written by the nation builders and empire builders of the first half of the 20th century, but by comfort women and Taiwanese aborigines, right, who will have their contributions. So you can see here the whole dispersal, the circulatory effect of what happens with histories and so on, just as a sort of sense. So what is the point of what I'm trying to do here? The point, I think, is basically to show that histories should not be seen as exclusive, bounded histories of a people. Histories are very much part of a shared heritage. They circulate in and out. They have different effects. You look at how, for instance, Marxism comes into China. It comes in from various different sources, from the Soviet Union, from France, from Japan. What happens in China? It is transformed, right? It circulates and is transformed into a peasant movement, whereas earlier it was a working class movement. And then when it goes out of China, as Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought, where does it go? It doesn't go to peasant societies. It goes to tribal societies, right? You look at southern Mexico, the Chiapas, you look at central India, you look at Nepal, you look at all these places. So how does it become adapted and transformed and circulated? This is the common heritage, I think, that we... And so why do I want to emphasize this? I want to emphasize this because I think that the role that history has played, while it's certainly been enabling and has had multiple purposes, also allows us, or allows nation states and custodians of nation states to argue for their unique sovereignty. By having a unique history, we are a unique people, we have a sovereign claim, and nobody dare tell us to do anything. Well, this is now a time and place where we have to listen to each other, and we have to recognize that, in fact, history cannot be the basis of your sovereignty because it is shared very much with the world. In fact, if you think of it, you realize that nations themselves, from the 19th till the mid-20th century and later, were themselves circulatory forms. You know, I can still remember when I was growing up as a child in India, and in most other Asian societies, a child was a child till the age of 5 or 6 or 7. After that, for most families, they were sent to the fields, they had to labor, and they were laborers, right? And what happens? new national constitutions all over the world has a child being a child with certain functions, duties, responsibilities till the age of 18. And everybody has that, right? So, I mean, you have more in common with a national somewhere else than you have with anything in your own society, in your older society, right? And this is the case in every, national histories all look the same. They have the same mode of periodization. They have the same technologies of Renaissance and things like that. So, I mean, you do get a lot of, so the nation itself is a circulatory form. Quite apart from the technologies like hertz and anthems and all of these kinds of things. So why is it that this global circulatory provenance of the nation gets misrecognized into these sovereign histories? Well, it's a question of, I mean, there's a big question that I do try to go into, but just to give you a brief summary, it is to say that there are it also becomes, the idea of a bounded linear history becomes very much tied to the breakdown of a universal system of rule where there's a moral order in which people follow rules, right? Here you are. And this then fits in very much with the capitalist revolution in which in the middle of the second half of the second millennium, which becomes very much tied in with the scientific revolution and with competitive capitalism that are often the groundwork of which is done by the nation state, right? So nationalism becomes a big part of this story. And then once you get the idea, once you get the destruction, the fall of universal transcendent ideals, you also have the idea that there is no greater supernatural or universal power to constrain the ability of humans to conquer nature and go out and get the world, right? To conquer people, to conquer nature. And so what we do is we are now at the end, towards the end, later point of that transition, where we call it the Anthropocene, where, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the word, it means it is an era which many natural scientists and geologists agree is one where the humans are affecting nature more than any other force in the world, right? And it is really leading to the crisis of sustainability, which is one of the most important crises that the book talks about and how we go about it. And it has very much to do with national histories and with the loss of transcendent powers in the world and all of these kinds of things. So the salvation of the world today is still more urgent. It is needed more physically than metaphorically. Planetary sustainability, I argue, should become the transcendent goal of our times. Now, that is not to say that I'm saying go back to religion. But what I am doing is looking at how religion was an earlier form, universal religions were an earlier form that created some kind of methodology of linking the personal to the natural environment and to the world and to the universe, right? And there is a relationship that we need to recultivate rather than just competitive nationalism and consumerism. So, what is the possibility of sustainability as a transcendent ideal? The main obstacle, it seems to me, is the imperative of national leaders to not sacrifice national interests. Whenever you hear about these global agreements for climate change and so on, it's very hard to get an agreement because, the U.S. says that first the Chinese must do this, and the Chinese says that we're a developing country, the U.S. must do this, and there are all these national mitigation. In fact, there's a very interesting proposal, a very simple proposal, and of course it's probably too simple, but most environmental groups, NGOs, and many intergovernmental groups also believe it's a very practical, it's the sort of most practical possibility, outlined by Mutsuyoshi Nishimura, who was the climate change representative of the Japanese government during the Kyoto climate change protocols, and where he has a proposal for collectively capped carbon budget, which should be at 660 billion gigaton in total emissions between 2010 and 2050. And he had a plan for that these carbon credits should be collectively owned and should be auctioned off on a polluter pays principle. And he has handicap provisions and so on. But they never work. I think despite enormous support from environmental activists, and they have become the biggest players now in terms of course, the nation states and national representatives do the acting, but the pressure points are precisely from these NGO groups and so on right now. And there is all this. There was a very important landmark deal, and I think it is symbolically very important, although we don't know its reality effects, between China and the United States in November 2014, when they both agreed. For the first time, somebody agreed, and these two major powers in the world agreed to do some cutting. Of course, the problem is that it will never get through Congress in the US, and the Chinese have lots of escape clauses as well. So, but nonetheless, at least it was a symbolic move in that direction. So, as I say, the most important major path in the world is through this transnational civil society in alliance and conjunction with the most important groups who are being affected by climate change. And these are these vulnerable, precarious communities in remote villages and towns and seacoast areas and forest areas all over, and I'm working on Asia, so I'll refer to Asia, but they're, of course, all over the world, but particularly in Asia. And the other important thing about Asia is that these people are still very much affected. They don't live in an entirely disenchanted world like many of us in the modern cities do. These people still believe that nature has a certain sacrality, it provides for them, and they often appeal to natural forces or supernatural forces to protect their nature and their livelihoods. So there's a very interesting kind of, if not an alliance, but a coming together of certain NGOs and civil society groups, whether they're at the local level, at the national level, or global level, very important connections that are developing in this new media space that I want to try and talk about. And these are weak, but I consider them resilient forces that can come up and rise again and again, in part because they have this capacity now to appeal to a whole different range of possibilities. And I'll give you one or two examples before I close off. And then I say that, for these people, more than anyone else in Asia, their traditions, their religious traditions or their cultural traditions are still very important. And there has been a kind of linking up between these NGOs, between intergovernmental organizations, within segments of the bureaucracy and so on that are interested in the case. And they use the pre-existing sort of cosmologies to their benefit or to be able to protect their environment. So in many parts of Asia, communities are resisting this effort, and they're using whatever resources they have, mostly religious resources. Taoism, animism, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism are being utilized to protect the resources of the community. And they often, especially in places now, even in remote places in China, when there is a big company that wants to come and do deforestation or do mining and so on, you get communities that organize around temple communities or that organize around other kinds of solitary communities to protest that. Now, most of these tend to be what we call NIMBY organizations, not in my backyard. You can take it somewhere else, but not here. The point of sort of linking up with higher levels of scales of civil society organizations and so on is that they can provide some kind of basis of translating these local efforts into a wider, a more universalistic project, right? And I want to give you one or two. Even in a place like China, which until 4 years ago had only 2,700 officially noted ENGOs, environmental NGOs, now has 8,000 of them. So that is one area that is being allowed to survive. Well, how much they're allowed to do is another matter now with the current government, but they are flourishing and they're connecting, and there are very important ways. For instance, I'll give you just this one example. in 1995, when the Three Gorges Dam was being built, initially they got funding from all different global agencies, US government, French government, UK, as well as World Bank, IMF, and Morgan Stanley, and so on. Dai Qing, who represented much of the environmental movement in China at that time, wrote a book called Yangtze Yangtze in 1995, which alerted the global civil society about the problems with the Yangtze Dam. What happens is that these people mobilized to such an extent that they could not get resources from the World Bank or the IMF or from the governments, and could not even get resources from these investment banks because their shareholders had been lobbied. So ultimately it became much more expensive in 2000 when China had to build the second tranche, to get resources for the second tranche of the Yangtze, right? So you can see the kinds of effects that these can have, right? And it is no surprise that today one of the things that the Modi government is fighting in India are NGOs in a very big way. And that is because they're claiming that they are producing developmental problems. And I can see there are tensions there, but there has to be a way to work out these kinds of issues. And one of the interesting things that has happened in China is that Lao Tzu, the famous Taoist god, has been transformed into an environmental god, which is not incompatible with what is, but he's actually called the Shanghai Pahu Shen. And whenever you go to a Taoist temple in China, now you burn only 3 sticks of incense. They now have to do all kinds of accountability for environmental transparency and so on and so forth. So these things are happening. They're not necessarily the big items, but small things are sort of. Here's an example. In fact, this Taoist Association did this with a British group called the Alliance of Religious and Conservation, which is the head of which is Prince Philip, and they're based in Bath. And so that's an interesting development here. And here is India has, of course, some very well-developed. So what I want to say is that, and this is the last point I will make, that finally this group of people, most of us have not really noticed what they're doing. This motley coalition of different forces are finally having an effect. So, for instance, there was a decision in the Indian Supreme Court in 2013 to recognize the tribal group from Orissa called the Konds. The Konds occupied a forest region in eastern India that had been stripped for bauxite mining, right? And these people, with the help of NGOs and with their own NGOs, sued these companies, and the case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that this region, the Kond region, was a sacred site of the Kond people and cannot be used for strip mining for bauxite and so on, right? So there are all these, and you've had lots of movements like this. And I think you are, in case you think that I'm just talking from the top of some entirely aspirational, mostly it is aspirational and normative, but it's not entirely so, because already we begin to see that 12% of the world's surface has been protected by one way or the other. A lot, yes, I would say that there are 160,000 legally protected areas in the world, national and international, including about 1,000 World Heritage Sites that are mostly natural heritage. Sometimes they are biodiversity heritage. Sometimes they're cultural heritage sites as well. Include the Eastern Himalaya regions is in the Yunnan, Tibet area is a very important area that has now become that way. And these cover over 12% of the land. They're the common heritage of humankind. As well, they should be declared. Some studies have shown that they have actually reduced rates of deforestation. In my view, these spaces are inviolable, right? They're sacred in the sense, not necessarily in the traditional religious sense, but they are sacred in the sense that they're inviolable. They're protected from the excesses around them, right? And so at least this is partially the legacy of what we might call an ecological spirituality, which I believe that we should be working to promote. And I'll just leave you with a picture of the total percentage of each country under protections. You see that Kazakhstan is one of the worst. The U.S., as you can expect, and Canada is because they have huge amounts of wild areas is still relatively protected. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was thinking I'll let you have another 10 minutes, but you have voluntarily given them up. So you'll get more at the end.
Okay.
Now, have you tossed a coin and decided who goes first?
Alphabetical.
You're going to go first.
Yes.
Okay, you go first. You're the local, so he's local as well. So.
Yeah, two locals.
Two locals, yeah.
Three.
Yeah. Professor William Callahan.
Okay, well, thank you, Lord Desai, and thank you, Prasenjit, for writing this book. My first reaction is, wow, it's an incredible book that really addresses the main issue that should concern us all about the lack of global sustainability of the consumerist capitalist model of modernity. And the way that Prasenjit goes about analyzing it is also quite radical, that I think he and I have the same sort of theoretical sympathies, that we're so-called critical theorists who are suspicious of master narratives. So therefore, we're suspicious of things like utopia, suspicious of sort of dealing with the big problems with big answers. But what Prasenjit does in this book is he argues quite persuasively that we can have a big answer to this big problem, that he says that we need to have a new form of transcendence, a new sort of, in a way, religiosity, that is not the sort of transcendence and religiosity that you see in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, the Abrahamic religions, but what he calls a dialogical transcendence, which is really quite interesting, because I guess the way I would describe it is that he's trying to, as he said, he's trying to transcend the notion of competing nationalisms. That's what he's trying to transcend, and competing sort of individualisms, to see the world in terms of a community of shared destiny. And I thought that the way he argues his case actually follows from his kind of more specific. So this is a grand book about grand things. But it also speaks to some of the books he's written, books and articles he's written before about redemptive societies in China, about how the kind of three religions are one, that you can be Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist, even though there's lots of contradictions between them. But in China, with these redemptive societies in the 19th and 20th century, people were able to negotiate to be all three or to be certain things, so that this contradiction was not a problem. And I think that's the sort of thing that he's trying to do, especially when he talked about a motley coalition of environmental groups. I think what he's putting together is a motley coalition of ideas, which I find really interesting. I guess I'll talk a little bit about the monologue, that's me. The epilogue at the end, because the epilogue, about 10 pages or so at the very end, really is a call to arms. And it's arguing that we need to shift from thinking just in terms of reasoned arguments. So he has 300 pages of reasoned arguments, heavily footnoted, really kind of thoroughly grounded arguments. But in the epilogue, I see him saying, okay, we've done the reasonable stuff, we've done the logical argument, now we have to have something else. And what he's telling us that we need to do is look beyond these reasoned arguments to think in terms of aspirations, dreams, and hope. Specifically, hope is what he talks about. And what he does is he says that hope, he positions hope as something that is undeconstructable, which is very interesting. I never heard of that before. But it really speaks to the sort of things that I've been looking at. And what's nice about it is a very optimistic ending about, yes, we can do things, we can solve these problems. And to me, this struck a chord because it made me think again about some of the research that I've been doing. So this is actually what I think a book should do, is not just tell me stuff, but sort of provoke me to think anew about stuff that I'm doing. What I've been doing lately is thinking about emotion in politics and films in particular. So that's why I put that video up there. It's a specific kind of film that's supposed to tug at your heartstrings. And I've been talking about affect theory, and that really seems to speak to what you're doing a lot, that affect theory is a very complex and abstract and annoying topic. It's very hard to pin it down. But generally, it seeks to shift our critical focus from facts to look at feelings, from stable individual identity to multiple flows of encounter, from text to nonlinear, non-linguistic, and non-representational genres, and from abstract rational knowledge to embodied forms of knowledge. And that's what I see you doing in the epilogue, or pointing in that direction. And so what I think that you've done the text, you've written the book, you've made the rational argument, what I think you should do now is make a film. You need to kind of challenge Simon Schama and make a better film. So it's not you kind of walking out in a battlefield, which is a typical Simon Schama history film, but I think that this topic really lends itself to a film. And it's already, I mean, we've seen in the past 3 or 4 months how films in China really kind of start things going. So on February 28th, Chai Ling, a former Chinese Central Television reporter or newscaster, she released her film Under the Dome, which is about pollution and how pollution is killing people in China. And it was on the web without censorship for a week, and over 300 million people viewed it, or 300 million views of it, which is huge. Huge, bigger than most countries. And what she did in that film is she appealed to emotion. She starts off by telling a story about how she got pregnant, she was really happy, then she got her first scan and saw the baby had a tumor. So this baby, even before it's born, her daughter had a tumor. So she has the baby. It turns out it's a benign tumor, but right as soon as the baby's born, she says that the doctor had to snatch the baby away even before she'd seen it and go and kind of take out the tumor. So the baby had surgery before it was an hour old. So my point is that she's really pulling at heartstrings here. She's really kind of saying, I'm a mother not just to my child, but to all of China and all of the world. And it was a very effective way of arguing her point. Now, some people, especially people who study visual culture, are very actually unsympathetic to this. People, I found, because I just started studying visual culture and visual politics, and the one thing that really comes out is that people who study visual culture don't like visual culture. That they're suspicious of it, that they think that, George W. Bush used images to dupe us all into the Iraq War, that kind of thing. And even in China, Chai Ling, right away, the kind of Chinese reaction, one of the reactions was, oh, well, who's she a front for? Whose interest is she serving? So she's against the oil company, but, who is she? She must be an instrument of somebody. But I think that what is good about the visual is that it allows us to kind of go beyond this sort of deconstruction or this hermeneutic urge to sort of always look for some hidden meaning and just be happy that you can kind of reach people, that you can touch them. And that's why I thought that film by Jia Zhangke, probably the most famous Chinese director right now, he was commissioned by Greenpeace China to make a 7-minute film about the environment and pollution. And what he did is he made a film with no dialogue. There's not a word spoken in it at all. And it's all about people. And you hear people cough. And you see people living. And you see people going to the doctor. And to me, it's just a very interesting way of making the points that you're making. So that's, I guess we'll end there, is that I think you can do it. I think that I would pay money to see your film.
You'll make it.
2 more minutes. Nope, that's all I have to say. So I enjoyed the book. I'm waiting for the movie.
Thank you. I think we ought to get Rana to go, or you want, Rana, you want to go next?
I think Stephan's next.
I'm next. You go. Okay. These LSE people are really pushy, aren't they?
He gets the last word.
No, I get the last word.
No, you don't.
That's what I'm sitting in a chicken.
I'm very glad that Prasenjit has left that map up, because
I was going to use the analogy of cartography and projections to describe Prasenjit's book. That's a Mercator's projection. And what's more, it's turned to centralized Europe.
Yeah, sure.
And you can turn them round, you know, so that you centralize Australia or China. I'm slightly shocked that you didn't actually put Asia central. But what Prasenjit's book does is not only change the geohistorical of the world, but it's no longer Mercator's projection or the linear histories that we're so used to, and which he's been writing against since his very first book. It's a projection of roots. What he's writing about circulatories, traffic, all the terms he uses is about very long-term processes of mutual influence and exchange, which pass through and pass across borders, which initially are certainly not national borders, but now are. And so it's a completely different way of seeing and a different methodology of doing history, geographically. And I thoroughly admire it and think it is the way we should be thinking. But one point I want to make, and you could tell there was a but coming, is that these are very long-term processes. And those long-term processes of the way in which we have been historically on long-term, very long, many hundreds of years, been influenced by each other across the globe, or smaller routes, but certainly across large distances, can't deal with the time span, can't deal with the urgency of the global crisis about which the book is and which it seeks to address. So reading the book, one is immediately induced into thinking, how can a similar consciousness of and alliance, networks is a favorite term of everybody, but it's also Prasenjit's term as well, those coalitions or networks, how can they influence us? How can we jointly influence in time to prevent our destruction of the world? That's what the book is about. It's about our capacities, not just capacities, but actual acts, which in aggregate are in danger of destroying the world. Not nature, but at least the world upon which we depend, which is a very short time span. It's sort of 2050. So that's one thing that I'm going to sort of harp on about in different ways. But then in the meantime, I'll come back to it. I want to take up the term of transcendence, and dialogical transcendence in particular, which he is also promoting. It's a way in which we can think beyond ourselves into something which is beyond self and beyond self-other. Self-other definitions, you define yourself as against others, particularly against national others. How can we get beyond that? How do we get beyond that? And so his book is, as Max Weber, as a sociologist, first started to do, is a way of trying to grapple with the cosmologies, as I would call them, and as he calls them. Other people call them religions, but they're a great deal more than just doctrinal religions. In fact, most of them are not doctrinal.
and Weber called them magic. The senses of the world which have existed throughout civilization, and civilization is as old as humanity, in my reconception of it, is how can that be enhanced, remembered, be revived, as indeed it has been in China as everywhere else, into a more another kind of narrative than was the narrative of the rituals and cosmologies of past times. This is a narrative which is more teleological, and that's what his book wants us to think about. How can we join in a mutual transcendence? Now, the source of some of this thinking is the so-called axial civilizations, which was a concept developed post Max Weber by Karl Jaspers, a German-Swiss German-writing philosopher and psychologist, phenomenological psychologist, who developed this notion of, which was an Enlightenment notion, of humanity as a project. How can we become human? Who is it that we can take as inspirations to become as human as we potentially could be, as distinct from being humans who destroy each other? And the philosopher with whom I want to draw Prasenjit's attention, I mean, I know you've read her work, but the philosopher who is a political philosopher, Hannah Arendt, with whom there was a great correspondence between her and Karl Jaspers, has another notion of dialogue, if you like, right? Where you call it dialogical transcendence. Hers is the notion of human transcendence, which is dialogical in the sense that we each affirm our differences from each other and acknowledge them. That is, local differences in which we have our own senses of belonging, but also maybe doctrinal differences, but dialogue can take place, and political action, as she calls it, can take place through our acknowledgement of those differences, and that dialogue is therefore always provisional. Politics is always provisional, and the kind of politics that she was promoting is one in which we are aware of our differences. And I'm just suggesting to Prasenjit that he can, accommodate that kind of notion of politics.
Mm-hmm. 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes only, right? Okay, so I come to the to the point that I said I'd come back to, which is that the redemptive societies and these coalitions of mainly organizations with a sense of transcendence, quite different from, and he gives a wonderful comparison in history, from the transcendences of monotheistic confessional exclusions. How can we develop a universalism that is not exclusive? Everybody thinks that they know what the world is like. How can we deal with ones that can say, okay, your sense of the world is different from my world, but we can have dialogue across that. His examples are always ones in which the coalitions are of civic organizations, as you will have gathered from this, and not of states. But as he just said, it's the actions take place through states. So one has to think. He is encouraging us to think, what could be a more urgent organization that can influence states more successfully than they have done so far? I mean, in China, his example is of the new dams and how they were prevented by civic organizations. But they did so through policy change done by local and then Wenjiabao's central government. So what would it be? How can we, in this country, through social media possibly, oppose the Murdoch and the dominant media who have put the Tories back in? It's so-called the non-compassionate, who pretend to be compassionate and pretend to be ecologically conscious, but betrayed all their promises on both counts. Who you know, in terms of national interest in their relationships to the federation in which we already are involved, which is the European Federation. It's as local as that. How can we, as civic organizations, create another world than that envisaged by the Tories and their region?
We've got 5 weeks to put it down. Okay. Rana.
True. Their policies are no good at all. All right, thanks very much. And it's, in a sense, a rather terrifying prospect after 3 such erudite presentations to have to go last in the sequence. But on the other hand, after I have shut up in a relatively short period of time, there'll be chance for a lot of discussion, I hope, from the floor, and we'll open this out. I'd like to start by adding to the chorus of praise for this book. Prasenjit has written something unsurprising to those who've known his work over the decades, a work of immense ambition. He appears to have read in a whole variety of languages and for a whole variety of traditions, a great deal of work in politics, in philosophy, and in ecology, saving the rest of us the trouble of reading the many hundreds of monographs you appear to have read to put this together, Prasenjit, and thereby enabling us to look just as clever as you are, but with rather less of the effort. So for that, we have to be immensely grateful. It's also rarer than it should be to see someone in the academy actually taking up agendas that matter in the world beyond the university. Some of us find it hard to believe that there is such a world, but it does exist, and it's important, and I think actually urgent, to see those of us in this particular profession engaging with what goes on outside in this sort of a way. And I must say, I for one would like to hear more in the discussion about where you see this book going in terms of a much more global conversation. So I want to say that this was a book that I enjoyed very, very much indeed. I have to take issue with just one aspect of the presentation you gave just now when you talked about the way in which various types of thought, including Maoist thought, made their way circulating from China. And then I thought you said that they then went out to, and you said the tribal peoples. And I thought the obvious place they were going to come, of course, was to the London School of Economics, which, if I remember well, possibly was something of a Maoist hotbed back in the day when perhaps a few people in this room were a little younger. But I'd also like to take a little time, as Stephan did, to question some of the ideas that you've put forward in the book, and then I hope start a dialogic element to the conversation, whether transcendent or otherwise, I'm not sure, and I hope stimulate further discussion. Because I have to say, I like this book very, very much, so much so that I read all of it, and that includes the index. And when I turned to the index, I found lots of interesting things under D. I found Dai Qing, the Chinese writer on the environment, who we mentioned. You didn't mention, by the way, that shortly after her great Yangtze, the Chinese state, of course, picked her up and held her under house arrest for quite a while. We found,
but she'd done her job.
She'd done her job by then, indeed. We find Durkheim, we find Deng Xiaoping, and indeed Derrida. We don't, shamefully, have Desai under D in the index there, but maybe in the second edition. And there's one other D, and I do want to bring this point to you that isn't actually in the index, and that's the word democracy. And I want to ask you about where that fits in to the model that you put forward. Now, I know, having read the text of the book and not just the index, that in fact questions of democracy, it seems to me, are actually very central to what you want to put forward. In a sense, you could possibly argue that it's not in the index because actually it's imbricated throughout the entire book. But I want to press a little harder than that. And I've got two questions. One's more open and one's more pointed. The open one is this, and that is the question, how does democracy fit in to the kind of questions and problems that you've raised? And actually, in that context, what does democracy mean? Because some of the terms that we've heard today are ones that have a great deal about them that are necessary and admirable, but also have problems. Let's take transnational civil society, a term which we're hearing more and more, and understandably so, particularly in an era when a great many global problems go well beyond national boundaries. On the other hand, I'm reminded of the retort of at least one social scientist speaking about this concept gave me, who said, well, global civil society isn't going to pay your pension, is it? And that wider point reminds us that the state still has certain roles, and there are reasons that people, including perhaps these people, do cling to it in certain cases. Now, this brings up, I think, the wider question of how different types of state fit into this model and their models of democracy alongside that. One of the things that I found that the book did do in bringing forward the concept of Asia, big Asia you might say, is that sometimes the lines seem to be a bit blurred. It's not that you don't explain with clarity, I think, the difference in terms of what happens in India, what happens in China, what happens in Vietnam, what happens in Japan. But I wondered if we could press you a little bit more on what difference it makes, if any, in your model, that these are different types of polities. These are different types of systems, and that in these polities, the way in which global civil society or local civil society as part of a global movement operates is different, and how that matters. And I think it matters for Asia, in a sense, more almost than it does for other parts of the world. Now, let me explain what I mean by that statement. And I'm going to do a rather broad statement here, which you're at great liberty. Indeed, I would encourage you to pull it apart in the most savage way possible when you make a reply. If we look at those parts of the world, very broadly speaking, the liberal polity and the pluralist liberal democratic polity is dominant in form, and in many cases in reality, in North and South America. It's normative, even if it's not necessarily exercised, in large parts, if not all parts, of Africa. Australasia, ditto. Europe, ditto. Asia, it seems to me, is the one part of the world where you still have large and significant polities which do not accept the premise of the liberal and pluralist polity as the norm. So I would differentiate there somewhere like Russia, which I think by anyone's honest and objective assessment is not a liberal and pluralist polity, but maintains the simulacrum of being one for a variety of reasons, the main one being that Mr. Putin thinks that appearing to have competitive elections and a simulacrum of civil society is the way to gain some sort of credibility in the international community. That is not the case with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is not the case with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It is not the case, most notably, with the People's Republic of China. And the question of state type and the way in which these different types of movements across boundaries have to engage with that sort of state is one that concerns me, and which I'd like you to extrapolate further from what you say in the book in terms of bringing democracy more explicitly into the question. So that's my broad question. And I want to then pose the second question, and then I will sit down, which is a more pointed and perhaps dangerous one. If we follow some of the logical conclusions, if you take one path of what your book suggests. And the question is democracy, is pluralism, is the liberal society a problem when it comes to sustainability? In other words, as Asian societies become richer, more prosperous, and more individuated, is this going to go against the grain of creating the kind of restricted growth and planetary protection that you are, for very understandable and admirable reasons, advocating in the book? And thinking about Asian traditions brings to mind exactly how this might happen. Let's take the use of a reinvented and in some ways rather hollow version of Confucianism, which has taken hold in a big way in China in recent decades. You don't have to go too far to be able to run into a statue of Confucius, a copy of a kind of simplified version of his sayings. Even if you go to his birthplace in Chufu in Shandong province, Confucius-branded merchandise, including liquor and all sorts of other things that I think he would have been a little surprised to see. So there's no question that after a dip during the Cultural Revolution, Confucius is back in a big way in China. But he also, the traditional view of Confucius, or one traditional view of Confucius, is one that informs a state-driven view, which basically makes him about a harmonious society, in which, on the one hand, harmony is about suppressing dissent, but on the other hand, often finds itself with an ecological wrapper around it, not in the Jay-Z sense, but in the plastic bag sense, an ecological cover in which people can argue that democracy and individuation is too heavy a price to pay if an environmentally sound aim is to be reached. Now, one could argue against that, and very obviously so, that the record of authoritarian China on the environment is just as horrific as that of many much more democratic societies. But many Chinese might argue, on the other side of that, that it's not necessarily more so, and that in terms of where China needs to go next, it needs more Confucian harmony and an anti-democratic harmony, and not less of it. I don't agree with that argument any more than I agree actually with that interpretation of Confucius, who I think can be used perfectly plausibly to argue for democracy. But isn't the danger potentially of your book's position that it could be taken up by agencies such as the Chinese Communist Party precisely to put forward that kind of anti-democratic discourse? And if, as I'm sure you disagree, that that's the way it should be used, how can it be articulated in such a way to make sure that that is not the direction that is chosen? In other words, the idea of Asian tradition, as we saw many distinguished people, including in Singapore in the 80s and 90s, try to use as a means of control rather than as a means of liberation. So, in the interests of liberal, pluralist and democratic debate, I think I will leave those comments there, but I look forward very much both to Prasenjit's responses and to the wider discussion here. And I want to end again by saying that this is an immensely stimulating and brilliant book, and I would encourage everyone in the room not only to join in the discussion, but also to take time to read and engage with its immensely important message.
Thank you. Okay,
I should say that the book is on sale outside, and Professor Duara will be signing.
Okay. Now, I'm going to make a slight change. Before Prasenjit answers the discussants, I want to see whether there are any questions, because very often there's not enough time left for questions. So are there... Oh, yeah, gentleman there.
Please identify yourself as well.
Hi, well, thank you for a very interesting talk, and I am Get Your Share on Twitter. I think that your talk, your basis of using religion to fight global warming is a very dangerous approach. I think the understanding of Christianity is possibly quite disturbing, because Christianity is an apocalyptic philosophy which craves annihilation. And I think this is something that you may have over-missed with trying to understand Christianity. That's quite confusing. And also, I think your approach is to spiritualizing land is anti-intellectual. I think the people should be educated into understanding why land is very important. It should be fighted for, not using it as a religious basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll be slightly more gentle and I'll have a question. I'd like to know, So you mentioned there's a lack in sustainability in how the movement can be applied to government policies and stuff like that. But how do you think we can make sustainability feature much more on political agendas? How do you make it more persuasive? Because right now, of course, the number of activists is growing, but it doesn't seem to be working so much. So how do you make it persuasive and also allow it to combine with the economic and capitalism and stuff like that? How do you make it attractive?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Anybody else wants to ask a question? Yeah. Why are only men asking questions? What is this? Yeah.
I note you've not mentioned recent trade agreements and coming trade agreements where there'll be much more pressure on governments, suing governments by multinational companies.
Yeah.
There's one coming up in Asia very soon, and we've got the transatlantic agreement. What aspect? Thank you for the book. I agree with much of what I've heard about it. It's just the commercial aspects and bullying by multinationals that concerns me.
And anybody else? One more? No?
There's a woman.
Oh, yes. Lady here. Thank you.
Thank you for a really nice talk. In response to the final response to your original talk, I'm wondering if you think that it's a necessary kind of consequence of the prosperity growing in Asian countries that they will adopt the form of liberal individualism that we see in kind of the countries where this concept sort of started, in the West or the global North, and if rather you think that with the prosperity, they will develop actually a new form of what we call individualism or competition or neoclassical competition that actually could be reconcilable with environmental sustainability.
Thank you. Am I all right? Okay? Good? No.
Yeah. Okay.
I will speak after you, so that
After me.
you
Okay.
have no
So,
chance of answering.
okay. So, how long do I have? 5-10 minutes?
You could
Yeah,
even
okay.
take 15 minutes.
Okay. I'm sure I'll finish. I
You've got
hope
a lot
to
of-
finish
lot of
before.
interesting
Yes,
things,
of
right?
course, and we can have some exchange and so on too. Just to go with the last set of questions that came up. Thank you all for your very close reading of the text and very generous and bringing up very important questions that have been provoked and that have provoked you, and this is exactly what the book, of course, I hope to do with the book. But just to go to some of the earlier comments, I'm sorry, Joe, from Twitter, did you say? What?
Yeah, I'm getting your show on Twitter.
Okay, so no, I'm sorry that the religious argument in the book is very complex. So you really need to read it, before, because I'm using religion in two kinds of, first I have the idea of dialogical transcendence, right? So it is completely, in fact, the earliest part of the book, there was a lot of critique that I am calling Christianity and the Abrahamic religions as way too radical and way too binary and way too destructive for this, and that I should sort of see how they also had these accommodative dimensions to them. So I certainly have a critique of religiosity as a form of radical transcendence. That's one set of issues on religion. The other is that I'm much more interested in world religions or large-scale religions or cosmologies, as Stephan has very usefully pointed out, as really their methodologies of creating different forms of identities. So it's not my book is not a political intervention book. It is much more a sort of a study of the concepts and methods through which identity formation takes place towards from a cosmological perspective. So I call it a historical sociology. So that's the other thing. And so how do we understand the methodologies of world religions and how they create types of identities? And thirdly, I don't think, and I think there's a very simple knee-jerk reaction to think that religion is very bad and we have to get away from it. And my own personal view is that. But I don't think that is a view that reflects world history. I mean, there's only been, even secularism, even in the so-called most secular states of Western Europe, is not something that is irreversible at all. And but it's expressed in many different kinds of ways. So in some ways we have to deal with a certain a core of human experience that we need to engage, that there is a notion of the sacred, of the inviolable that is there in whatever, whether religious or secular. I mean, nations have, democracies have certain core inviolable spaces, and we've got to be able to think of how to engage rationally with those sources of emotions. And I think that Bill spoke to this issue more than anyone else, and he can also answer the question. So on the question of politics, I think I'll come to the issue of politics when I address the last two comments, which had a lot to do with politics. Trade agreement, we are, of course, living in Singapore, much more interested in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also, the Chinese sort of version, the RCEP, and so on. And it is increasingly becoming noticed that these TPPs do, in fact, give much more agency to multinational corporations, and this is a huge danger. But that is an issue. I mean, it's a red flag, that has suddenly we've become alerted to, and that I think all these groups have to become attentive to and address. I don't have any answers to that, but what I can say is that, nation states are actually beginning, despite their commitment, their fierce commitment to sovereignty and so on. If we follow someone like the work of Ulrich Beck and so on, we see that they are actually beginning to compromise on sovereignty without admitting so, by engaging a lot of agreements. Now, what you point out is that the beneficiaries are not necessarily the causes, but in fact multinational corporations. But I think this is a mixed story. There is some of that, but there are also sort of agreements that are coming to that are affecting the capacity of nation states and affecting much more intergovernmental agencies to play a role. And I certainly feel that there are several intergovernmental agencies that do have the cause of climate change in their, if not in their hearts, in their agendas. Now the question of new consuming classes, what it is. In Asian societies, Natalia, my daughter's classmate and friend, is a very, I think, is precisely why I have written this book, because there is the sense that India and China can sort of go along the same path that the Western countries have sort of trod, and that has led to this situation. And it seems to me that that is infeasible even at the present moment. I think we are in very dire, you look at everything, the Anthropocene is not just going to show up in one cataclysmic event. It's already happening. When you see droughts for 3 years in so many different parts of the world, and so on, when you see floods that are, it's 1 year is the floods, 1 year is the drought in the same areas. I mean, what are you going to do, right? It's with us. So, I mean, how to then, that's the political question, how to then make it sort of much more relevant in the political system. I mean, you have certain progressive countries with the Greens and so on do play a much more important role. New Zealand, I'm sorry, I am very lame. The European Union has a very important role there. And I think in certain sectors in Indian society, it's also very important here. So that just has to happen, and that's part of the project. That's why I've done, significant reason for having done the book, getting them to look at their own traditions to see how to sort of work with this. So those are, I think, some of the questions. Should I respond to the others?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
This is your time.
Yeah, I think on the wonderful comments, very generous comments that Professor Callahan made, he says, I think he points to something very important that not many people have taken from the book, which is precisely the relationship between our feelings and motivations and rationality, right? And how we think of a problem. That you can think yourself blue, as we have done in the ivory towers of academia, but unless you get people to actually feel something and to link that issue with a program, right? That the whole sort of interpenetration of and I call it sacrality, but I call it the sacrality of hope, right? Because hope is something, as we know, the common saying is that hoping against hope, it can never really die because it always reappears. And I use the words of Lu Xun in that conclusion, which is really the only thing that he had and the only path that we can have. What else can we do? So, in a sense, in response to also the temporalities that Stephan talks about, right? That these are, so he says that basically my work is on a very large historical scale, the temporalities are very extensive, but the problem is so immediate, right? And we need to have responses that match that immediacy, right? How can we do that? Well, first, my first comment is that, there are hopefully many people in the world who are trying to address that thing. And I think here I'm an agnostic on the issue of economics and technology. I'm not opposed to it. I think, for instance, that I certainly oppose geoengineering schemes that are huge and large, but I think behavioral economics can do something. I think there's a lot that's wrong, but they can do something about these things by making pricing things in certain ways and so on. It's just that with what mind and heart do they come, right? That's another matter. So a certain school of economics, I think, could be able to address these kind of issues. Maybe Meghnad's school, Lord Desai's school, and I think technology can also play a role in these kinds of things. For instance, I think what Barack Obama tried to do in the U.S. Was a very useful thing, giving opportunities and cuts and all of these subsidies for green technologies and all of these things. Of course, the radical position would be, as long as you're committed to technology and capitalism, that's it, you're finished. But I don't see ourselves getting out of that anytime soon, right? So, let's be a little more practical and work with whatever we can. But it still doesn't answer the question of immediacy, but I don't think that I can handle that issue as a historian of the long scale. On the other issue which you brought up, which is, I think, close to Rana's issue, the issue of politics and the Hannah Arendt. And here I'm, I think, also very influenced, actually, who was influenced by Hannah Arendt is Habermas, right? And Habermas is very concerned about the issue about politics and democratic politics. But I would like to, in some ways, play off this Habermasian Hannah Arendt notion of politics in the life world and the politics of the life world with Rana's notion of democracy as a more formal system, a more procedural system that you asked partially about, I think. And it is true that I don't talk about democracy because so much of Asia is non-democratic in that procedural sense, I believe. Again, I'm an agnostic on the issue. I think a lot of things, well, I think two things which may be contradictory. One is that the Chinese system can get a lot of things done. even in the, not just growth, but even in curtailing certain types of growth if it wants to put its mind to it. The EPA in China is a very progressive institution, and it continues to be and does a lot. The problem is systemic in some senses. The message that the central government gives, this is good cop, bad cop, right, is that we're doing everything. From Hu Jintao onwards, you've had sustainable civilization as the goal, as a dream, and all of this stuff. But the problem is, of course, that the messages going to the local polities is still about quotas and productions and target and so on, right? And it is certainly true that at the core of this, the principal problem is one of accountability, right? How do you get these guys to be accountable to society, to goals that are relevant? And to that extent, but I don't think you need a formal democracy for that. I don't want to say, I personally am a Democrat. I believe in democratic virtues and in institutional processes, but we've also seen how, as you point out, that democracy can lead to much more destruction, right? In the sense that you lead to classes of these rising consumers who vote on the basis of what they can consume, which is what produces the problem. So, in a sense, my response is that I don't think there can be a philosophical answer to these things. I think you have to work with whatever institutions are available that promote your goals. They may be different in one and they may be different in the other. I still think that there is a certain overlap. I think NGOs, which have been growing in such huge numbers in China, a lot of them are gongos and so on, or ENGOs, there is an overlap in their role with others. They play watchdog roles. They play the role of holding the feet to the fire. Is that the expression? Mm-hmm. Anyway, of many of these things. And, of course, they're subject to crackdowns sometimes and so on. But they do play a role. In fact, very recently, just a month ago, in China, you had there was a reservoir that was going to be created on the Yangtze, which was given up, and the whole article, both in the Western press and in the Chinese press, says it is very much a result of environmental NGO pressure, right? And so, to some extent, they have effects as well. And you don't need a formal democratic system to be able to have a certain kind of accountability. And I would say that ultimately the question of different political systems is, of course it's important. Of course it's important. We know that. But we emphasize the importance so much that we don't recognize that there's a massive circulatory effect going on. Right? There's all kinds of things. One of the things that I've seen even in Chinese hydropower organizations in Southeast Asia, they're becoming extremely susceptible to issues of corporate responsibility and all of those kinds of things that NGO groups are bringing to them. So there is a shared area as well.
Intervention on that.
Sorry?
Could I just make one sentence?
Sure.
Just to say, isn't the circulation, though, Prasenjit, also the other way around? For instance, in India, you hear more and more discourse about how if India did things like China and didn't mess around with all this democracy business, then much more would get done. Isn't that dangerous?
I don't think it's very dangerous. I think, maybe I don't think you can get rid of democracy in India. It's a little too well implanted or whatever, embedded. But on the other hand, there is probably a need, not necessarily for this kind of strong man, but you do need a strong executive and strong parliament and things like that. Or effective, let me say effective. So, I don't see it in absolute terms.
But if I can intervene, give you a hard time now.
Yeah.
The question that I'm hearing is that you are promoting civil society as the answer.
Yeah.
But how can you have civil society in an authoritarian state? And you're saying that you can, but it just seems that it still seems to be sort of either a contradiction or a tension.
It's a tension. I don't think it's a contradiction. I think we have huge organizations in China, in the environmental group, that do have effects, right? It is a long-term danger, but that's not to say there isn't. Look at India. I mean, right now, the Modi government is going after the funding of all of these NGOs.
Only foreign ones.
But they brought up, every NGO has to submit now where their sources of funding have come from.
That's been long before the Modi government.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry. Let's. No, I think xenophobia is universal in democracies.
Yeah, sure.
If you can't do something, blame the foreigners.
Yeah.
Anyway, please. I shouldn't.
Yeah. So that is it.
Can I say a few things? First of all, this really is a very, what I would call, a book with thick texture. It's for someone like me who's an economist, this is hard work. But I have read it and it is very, very impressive. I learned a lot. I'm old enough to tell you that we had a global crisis and we solved it. And that's the nuclear Armageddon. When I was a student in America, they used to have a program at the end of every year. Was the clock at 5 minutes to 12 or 3 minutes to 12? Were we going to blow ourselves up or not? I mean, this is serious existential threat. I mean, your global environment may happen by 2050, by which time I shall be safely dead. But this was, and I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I more or less thought, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for, and we're all going to be blown up. And there's no point in rushing home. Partly I didn't have money, but partly the home will be blown up as well. So one thing I would say as a comparative thing, study how the world got out of that existential threat. Nowadays, nobody cares about nuclear. There are so many nuclear nations. I mean, soon there'll be 70 nuclear nations, and nobody gives a monkey about it. How did we lose the fear of it? It may be delusion, but that was done through state action, not through grassroots action.
I'm not
100% sure. There are grassroots forces, but I would say that it was when the eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation took place and war did not happen, then people say, okay, there are responsible enough people who will take care and they will not go to war. Okay? So that's one thing. Secondly, I think that in a sense, there's transcendence and all that. And I'm not a postmodernist. I'm actually a modernist. I'm really kind of real 19th century modernist. And I think that there's only, all these religions have been there for ages. There's only been one really transcendental global phenomenon, and that's capitalism. And the problem is capitalism is really an unbeatable system. Nobody has found anything. I mean, countries and philosophies have died fighting it. And the problem is that within a capitalist system, you're trying to get coalitions of small forces across countries and so on. Will they agglomerate into a big enough force to even divert the course of capitalism as it is, or will they? The European Union actually believes itself to be living in a post-capitalist world, but it's completely deluded. But that's another story. So I think one thing is that it may be that the problem is not of dialogic thing, except as instruments to agglomerate these movements, but basically the enemy is so powerful that, like you talk about the new consumers. I mean, every country has gone through this new consumerism. Give people a bit more money in what they want to do, they want to consume. This is freedom. Freedom is consumption. So, in a sense, we really face. Now, I'm going to tell you one hopeful thing, because you also read old texts. And as Marx said, in the famous preface, mankind only solves itself such problems as can be solved, because the point is the problems don't arise until the conditions of the solutions are also there. You know where I'm speaking from. It's prefaced the contribution to the critique of political economy. Now, if you take that sort of view, okay, it's a circular kind of reasoning. it may be that the discussion you had on technology and so on may yet, it is a combination of technology, behavioral change, and a bit of pricing. Which is maybe working at the same time as your bottom people are working, right? And it may be that this is how so-called mankind will find a solution to its problems.
If it does.
Yeah, but, if it doesn't, you tell me, because I'll be gone, as I said. But you see, I'm not at all afraid of free trade, because, countries left to themselves do things terribly badly. The entire Eastern European economies were terrible with their environment, without the cooperation of any multinational. So it's not necessary multinationals are always evil. Yeah. They may, if they find good environment profitable, they'll do that.
Yeah. If they can sue Australia for billions for cigarettes because they want plain packaging.
Now, I think this fear is always raised because local capitalism doesn't like competition. So they're always trying to keep out Americans and all that. The French have a problem. Nobody watches their films, so they don't want this competition anyway. But no, I think this is a very good book, and I think I've learned a lot from it. But I still, and this is not just about your book, but there's a whole environmental problem, that people are more apocalyptic. And if you're more apocalyptic, then you deny yourself a solution. But also, again, one of the great problems, this is economists who dealt with it, our interests are not common. Yeah. There is no single global environmental problem, which is why, you can't get a treaty. Yeah. Because as soon as you start getting a treaty, somebody says, hey, but you may want this, cleaner air, but we want more consumption.
We want dirty air.
No. We want more consumption. Yeah. If I'm in Delhi living in 45 degrees heat, I want air conditioning. Yeah. And you may be okay. So I think there are this problem. So environmental change is a local problem when it needs to be dealt with local floods and so on. The global environmental problem may be a intellectual construct. No, intellectual construct, not an illusion. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you
for allowing me to speak for this long.
Can I respond?
Yes, of course.
By 1 minute, I think.
Sure.
I think in some ways, Meghnad and I may have more in common. Because I too think I think also that in a funny way, we can think of multinationals as, the most evil thing in the world, but they too respond to a notion of circulatory, if not ethics, rules, right? So if you have, of course, they can be bent and so on, but you do have organized. I talk about Conservation International and so on, which come out of these capitalist organizations and try to do some compensation or renewal or re-energization and so on. I do believe that is more like two steps backward probably and one step forward, but there is something. There are these elements of hope, and I think you're absolutely right. The way you put it is that there are these technological and other kinds of things that can work, and regulatory regimes, but then the lower order. Well, I don't think they're lower order. They're just as global, especially if you look at the kinds of points of contact and alliance and connections. What we need to think of more specifically, I think, from this book is what are the pressure points at which they can operate to create a more particularly in the complex condition that you bring up, that there are local differences and global, but there must be something that is both intermediate and at the global level that can impact the others. So I think that's the kind of the pressure point situation, which comes back to your politics thing also, that can work. Okay.
Okay, I see people stirring, so
Yeah.
We'll end it here.
We
so I
must
want to thank
yes.
Professor Duara and
Okay,
thank all
thank
the
you.
participants.
Thank you all very much.